Blog Talk Radio.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining me on tonight's show. Tonight our topic is post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD as it's most commonly known. Approximately 7.7 million American adults age 18 or older, or about 3.5% of people in this age group in a given year have PTSD or, some of the symptoms at least are displayed. It's a stressful world and not uncommon. So PTSD can develop at any age, including childhood, but research shows that the average age of onset is about 23 years old. About 19% of Vietnam veterans experience PTSD at some point after the war. And this disorder it also appears after a violent personal assault, such as a rape, a mugging, domestic violence, terrorism, natural or human-caused disasters, or accidents. It's a reaction to trauma of any type. PTSD can commonly develop in the hours or days following a traumatic event, although it sometimes can take weeks, months, or even years. PTSD was once considered a psychological condition of combat veterans who were shocked by and unable to face their experiences on the battlefield. Much of the general public and many mental health professionals doubted whether PTSD was a true disorder. Soldiers with symptoms of PTSD often faced rejection by their military peers and were feared by society in general. Those with the PTSD symptoms were often labeled as weak and removed from combat zones or sometimes discharged from the service. In 1980, PTSD was finally recognized as a disorder with specific symptoms that could be reliably diagnosed, and it was added to the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. PTSD is recognized as a psychobiological mental disorder that can affect survivors of not only combat, but also the major emotional losses, serious accidents, natural disasters, attacks, the abuse. PTSD is also associated with changes in the brain function and structure, and these changes provide clues to the origins, treatment, and prevention of PTSD. Some cases can be delayed with only subtle symptoms showing up initially, and more severe symptoms emerging months after the trauma. Effective treatments are available, including talk therapies such as exposure therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, and medications. Central to PTSD research is studying how strong emotions such as fear are linked to memory formation and retrieval. Scientists are also working to find important factors that influence these responses, including relevant brain structures, biological or genetic traits, and psychosocial factors. And tonight we are joined by a special guest. Tim Carter is a Vietnam veteran who not only went to Vietnam to fight in one of the deadliest wars, but arrived in time for Tet. However, Mr. Carter survived the war. In 1978, Tim dealt with the death of a spouse and a 15-month-old son and his sister. All of these tragic events piled on top of being raised by an alcoholic father who attempted to kill Tim twice and a mother who passed away when Tim was 15. This created a stronger case of PTSD. First, Tim, I'd like to say welcome home and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Excuse me, I had to cough. Would you like to begin by giving us an overview of your life, especially those events that led up to the realization that you had symptoms of PTSD?
No, actually, the events themselves, you pretty much covered. I was in the Marine Corps. I joined the Marines, enlisted for 3 years. When I got out of high school, I volunteered to go to Vietnam, and then when I was in Vietnam, I volunteered to go out to where it was dangerous. I was in communications, and I, might have listened to my gunnery sergeant or top sergeant who said, are you sure you really want to go where you're volunteering to go? Because it's, he called it Indian country, which didn't occur to me until years later how racist that was. So anyway, I got out to the bush about 3 days before Tet of 1968. And if anybody doesn't know what Tet is, it's a Vietnamese holiday. It celebrates the New Year's, but it was the largest offensive by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong in the history of the Vietnam War. And there were attacks from the DMZ all the way down to Saigon. And what made this particularly psychologically effective was the fact that North Vietnamese regulars were all over the country, as opposed to usually only fighting in the northern part of Vietnam. And that was my first exposure to war, other than what I had seen on TV. And I discovered very quickly that war in real life wasn't nearly as heroic or quote-unquote fun as it appeared to be when I was watching John Wayne movies. In May of 1968, there was also another offensive, which wasn't nearly as broad as the Tet Offensive, but still quite serious. It didn't get nearly as much publicity, but I spent the month of 1968, the May of 1968, I was attached to the Korean Marines at the time, waiting to be overrun. They told us that we were going to be overrun that month, which, thank goodness, never happened, because I'm still here to talk about it. Anyway, I had no idea that I had post-traumatic stress disorder, and there's a couple of things that are important to distinguish. First, I want to read the actual definition that is in the DSM-4, or the American Psychiatric Definition. The person has been exposed to a traumatic event in which both of the following were present. 1, the person experienced, witnessed, or was confronted with an event or events that involved actual or threatened death or serious injury or a threat to the physical integrity of self. And 2, the person's response involved intense fear, helplessness, and horror. Now, post-traumatic stress was, or post-traumatic stress syndrome, it used to be called post-traumatic stress syndrome, not disorder, has been related to combat veterans, which is what I am most familiar with. But by that definition, this also applies to anybody that's been physically abused, a woman that's in a battered relationship, a woman that has been raped. In fact, it was the efforts of Vietnam vets and women's groups that were dealing with women that have been raped and battered, putting pressure on the psychiatric community that actually got post-traumatic stress disorder listed as something that was real and not imagined, and that was in 1980. This is post-traumatic stress. Well, let me back up a second. Everybody has post-traumatic stress. And there's a difference between post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress, let's say you had a really horrible week at the office. Just every day was not a good day, and by the time Friday came around, all you wanted to do was just sit and hide and not talk to anybody or anything. That would be post-traumatic stress. chances are by Saturday morning or by the time the weekend was over, you probably were back to your normal kind of level of stress. Post-traumatic stress disorder is when the trauma that's been experienced intrudes itself into a person's daily life. One of the most common misconceptions about PTSD is that it is invisible, because in what's shown on TV and in movies, the person with post-traumatic stress disorder is usually out, killing people or blowing things up, or is a total crazy person. It's something that's very, very evident. The reality is that the vast majority of people that have post-traumatic stress disorder have not necessarily any outward symptoms. You might think somebody was particularly intense or maybe a little irritable or kind of being a jerk, or it can manifest itself in substance abuse, whether it's alcoholism or other drugs. Some people become workaholics. Some people might become sex addicts. Other people might become totally isolated. Oftentimes, people with post-traumatic stress disorder experience several relationships. They're not able to stay in relationships, which from the outside, you wouldn't necessarily relate that or point to that person and say, oh, they have post-traumatic stress disorder. The vast majority of people with PTSD are living and functioning in a quote-unquote normal life. That was the first thing that I learned, because I thought, well, I'm not out, killing people or anything like that, so I don't have post-traumatic stress disorder. It was in, actually, I think it was 1981. I was living in Hawaii with my wife at the time and driving down Kapiolani Boulevard in Honolulu, and I saw this big sign that said Vietnam Vet Center, and I thought, wow, I wonder what this is all about. And had no idea. Right now, those are just called vet centers, which is more appropriate. Anyway, so I went into the Vietnam Vet Center actually to volunteer to help, if there was any way that I could help other veterans. And I learned, after being there a short time, that they had these groups called combat rap groups for veterans that had been in combat. And I thought, well, I don't really need that. And they said, well, it might be helpful. You might do that, because I wanted to help in counseling others. So I went through a combat rap group and was really almost stunned to learn how my experiences matched the experiences of the other veterans that were there. And I'm talking about experiences after the fact, after returning from war. And I thought, wow, maybe I actually do have this, whatever is called post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder. Quick example, for years after I got back from Vietnam, whenever I would go into a restaurant, or any place to eat, I always usually sat in a corner. And if I couldn't sit in a corner, I always sat with my back to the wall so I could see the door. I didn't really think anything about it. It's just what felt comfortable to me. So the first time I heard another veteran...
Is that to watch the environment
it's part
around
of
you? Or?
Right. One of the symptomologies of post-traumatic stress disorder is what's called hypervigilance. You're always on alert, always aware. I wanted to see I wanted to be able to see the door. And this wasn't a conscious thing. I was conscious of, this is where I'm comfortable. But I didn't relate it to my experience in Vietnam. Startle reactions, which are very common among combat veterans, I would have those. But if I would have them when I first got back from Vietnam, I know my best friend and I at the time, who was also a Vietnam vet, if a car backfired and we were on the street, we were both on the ground almost immediately, and which drew laughs from people most of the time, which makes one feel like there's something really screwed up with them.
Sure.
I use a stronger word, but I choose not to. But I had startle reactions for years afterwards, and I always thought there was something wrong with me, because I shouldn't be having these startle reactions. I must be really screwed up. And I related it to war, but I related it to somehow me